Can we get you to take your seats, please? Thank you. Just yank on the coat next to you and get him to sit down. Okay, good evening, everyone. And I hope you've all received your emails, but if you haven't, we've tried to inform everyone that our scheduled speaker, Hank Greenberg, Chairman and CEO of AIG, has come down with a bad case of the flu. He's very sorry that he was unable to be here tonight. He's very disappointed, actually. But we are very grateful that Dr. Jacob Frankel, Vice Chairman of AIG, has graciously changed his schedule and very short notice and able to be here tonight to talk to us. So we're definitely very appreciative of that, and we're looking forward to a very interesting program tonight. So we're going to start serving dinners, and I'll see you very shortly. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for that attention so promptly. Welcome to the 309th dinner meeting of the Economic Club of Chicago. I'd like to make a few announcements now about the upcoming club season. Our second forum of the program year will be March 8th at the Fairmont Hotel. The subject is Major League Baseball, not hockey, in 2005 and beyond. We're delighted to have Bud Selig, the 9th Commissioner of Baseball, and Alan Sanderson, Associate Chair in the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago, for what we hope is a lively discussion. Our annual dinner is scheduled for Tuesday, April 19th, and I'm happy to announce that our very own Miles White over here, Chairman and CEO of Abbott Labs, will be the speaker. There you go. I think you're the only speaker that's gotten a woo-hoo. The announcement for this will be in the mail very soon, so please make sure you mark your calendars. And now it is my pleasure to introduce those seated at the speaker's table. As usual, as I call their names, I'll ask each to stand and remain standing until all the introductions are completed. And once again, please hold your applause until all have been introduced. Beginning on my far left, Ann Donahoe, Healthcare Financial Advisor. Arthur Martin, Senior Vice President, Trans-Western Commercial Services, and a Secretary of the Club. Zhao Zhou, Partner, Baker McKenzie. Sarah Saratsky, Managing Director, Marsh USA Incorporated. John McCarter Jr., President and CEO, the Field Museum. Lester Knight, Founding Partner, Roundtable Healthcare Partners. Alan Muchin, Chairman Emeritus, Catton Muchin, Zavis, and Rosamond. Deepak Jain, Dean of the Kellogg School of Management, Northwestern University. James Patrick, Chief Executive Officer, Smart Medical Technology Incorporated. Leslie Heineman, President, Leslie Heineman Auctioneers. Thomas Cole, Chairman of the Executive Committee, Sidley Austin Brown and Wood, and Director of the Club. Mike Zabrowski, former President and CEO of Motorola, and now Consultant and Director with Motorola, and a Director of our Club. Pam Strobel, EVP and Chief Administrative Officer, Exelon Corporation, and on the Executive Committee of the Club. And Tom Patrick, Chairman, President, and CEO, Peoples Energy. Now beginning on my far right, Terry Brady, Partner, Winston & Strawn. Mark Willis, Executive Vice President, American International Group. David Blake, publisher, Crane's Chicago Business. My light just went out. We're going to move this over here. Kristen Chen, partner, Skadden Arps, Slate, Meagher and Flom. John Rao, president and CEO, Miami Corporation, and director of the club. Allison Chung, president, Teamworks. Marshall Bhutan, president, Chicago Council on Foreign Relations. Lyle Logan, senior vice president, managing director of private banking, the Northern Trust Company, and a director of the club. Craig Ducheslaw, chief executive officer, Ducheslaw Industries Incorporated. William Bartholomew, vice chairman, Willis Group Holdings Limited. Timothy Teleke, senior advisor, AIG. And we've already talked about Miles White, chairman, CEO, Abbott Labs, and a vice chairman of the club. Now may I have a round of applause for this distinguished group. And now we'll take our traditional 10-minute break before we introduce the speaker. So 10 minutes gives you until 5 minutes of 8. Everybody have a watch? 10 minutes. Please be back in your seats. Could I ask you to please take your seats? I think I already asked that. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to begin. Thank you. Let me again add my regrets that our scheduled speaker, Hank Greenberg, was unable to be with us tonight. And I'd like to hope that we all really and truly wish him well and a speedy recovery. But it does leave us with a question. How do you replace someone whom Barron's has called Mr. Irreplaceable? Someone who is one of the world's richest people, according to Forbes magazine, and someone who was named among the most respected global business leaders in a survey taken by the Financial Times. Someone who is one of the longest serving and most successful CEOs in American corporate history. Well, Dr. Jacob Frankel, Vice Chairman of American International Group and Chairman of Aon's Global Economic Strategies Group, is a pretty special someone himself. As a noted academic and business leader, he spent decades helping set policy and shape economic trends worldwide. And he's also something of a homeboy here in Chicago. After receiving a BA in economics and political science from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, he came to the University of Chicago, where he earned both his MA and his PhD in economics. He also served on the faculty for the 70s and almost all of the 80s, where he was the David Rockefeller Professor of International Economics and served as editor of the Journal of Political Economy. From there, he became the economic counselor and director of research at the International Monetary Fund. And in the 90s, he served 2 terms as the governor of the Bank of Israel, where he is credited with reducing inflation, liberalizing Israel's financial markets, removing foreign exchange controls, and integrating the Israeli economy into the global financial system. He's also been chairman of the Board of Governors of the Inter-American Development Bank and vice chairman of the Board of Governors of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Pretty much in short, Dr. Frankel gets around. He's also is a laureate of the 2002 Israel Prize in Economics and has been honored by the governments of Argentina, Italy, and the Czech Republic. He's written numerous books and articles in the fields of international economics and macroeconomics. He also serves as chairman and CEO, get this, of the Group of 30. We're not going to tell you what that is. Okay, we will. It's a private international group of very senior leaders from the public, private, and academic sectors, which aims to deepen understanding of the international economic issues. Prior to assuming his current position, Dr. Frankel served from 2000 to 2004 as chairman of Merrill Lynch International, and at AIG he helps lead an international icon that does business in 140 countries and sells everything from traditional property, casualty, and life insurance to coverage for internet identity theft and hijacking. And AIG's financial service businesses also includes asset management, airplane leasing, and more. Most importantly, AIG has a long history of rewarding its shareholders from the time the company went public in 1969 and in 2003. An investment then would have returned around 19,000% versus a 700% return for the S&P 500. I'm sure Dr. Frankel will be able to tell us exactly how they did that. But before he does, one final note. Dr. Frankel's boss, as many of you know, is 79 years old, and despite his current bout with the flu, shows no sign of slowing down. But Hank Greenberg has created a succession plan. His recommendations have been sealed in an envelope to be opened when he leaves the company. Only then will the world know who succeeds him. Which reminds me of a story about when Thomas Jefferson took over from Benjamin Franklin as America's ambassador to France. When Jefferson came to call, the French foreign minister asked him, "So, you replace Monsieur Franklin?" "No," said Jefferson, "I succeed him. No one can replace him." And I'm sure Dr. Frankel would say the same thing about replacing his boss tonight. Which means the Economic Club of Chicago has a scoop. We know who's succeeding Hank Greenberg. At least for this evening. And here he is. Please welcome the Vice Chairman of American International Group, Dr. Jacob A. Frankel.
Thank you very much. First of all, as you can realize, I'm not Hank Greenberg. But when Hank Greenberg will come here a decade from now, I'm sure that the chairman will speak about the sealed envelope. Let me assure you that he will come here also before the end of the next decade, because he basically asked me to tell you that he is looking forward to come here once the timing arrangement will work out for him. I listened very carefully to the introduction, and I must say I was very flattered. So much so that I thought maybe I should just stay seated. You know the story about this guy who was honored. He was invited to the podium, and the chairman introduced him as the guy who has made billions of dollars by discovering gold in California. And here he comes to tell us about his discoveries. Well, he went to the podium and said, ladies and gentlemen, let me clarify a little bit. First of all, it was not gold, it was coal. Second, it was not California, it was somewhere else. Third, it was not billions of dollars, it was millions of dollars. Fourth, it was not me, it was my brother. Fifth, he did not make money, he lost money. But since I got the microphone, let me just, and that's the way it started. So let me use the microphone as one should. First of all, I'm really very pleased and happy to come back to Chicago. For me, it's, as was said, it's a hometown. When I see here Terry Savage, I remember how she asked me many years ago, when I was still a naive professor at the university, how do you explain the fact that the yen has just crossed the 300 mark to the dollar? Those of you who do not follow exchange rates know that it is now about 100 or so to the dollar. So a lot of things have happened since. And indeed, the subject of today's remarks is how does one operate in a changing environment? I did get it on my own flesh when a few hours ago, to be more precise, yesterday afternoon, I was told that we are in a changing environment and I better plan to come to Chicago. And that's where it became clear who is the real boss. And I'm delighted to be here. The world has changed dramatically. Not only the locomotives of the world have changed. Remember, just 15 years ago, the locomotives of the world were Germany, were Japan. They were the engines. And today they are in the back parts of the car. And now we have new locomotives. Years ago, even countries were different. Remember, there was a Soviet Union. There was an East Germany. There was a Czechoslovakia. Remember that there was no euro. There was no EMU, European Monetary Union. There was no ECB, European Central Bank. The world was very, very different. Which reminds me of the story about Mr. Jones. The guy came to visit his friend after not seeing him for some years, and he knocked at the door, and he comes in and says, wow, you have changed. You used to have a beard, and now you do not have one. You had to have glasses, now you don't have. You had a lot of hair, you don't have it. What happened to you, Mr. Jones? And he says, my name is not Mr. Jones. You also changed your name. Well, this world has changed in many more profound ways than these superficial stories. The world of globalization means that what happens in one part of the world affects the other part, that concepts are different, that the technological revolution is for real, that the communication revolution is for real, that sectors that grow up rapidly today may not be there tomorrow, and vice versa. And most importantly, I see here I wanted to say new friend Deepak, but it looks like, based on our mutual acquaintances, it is an old friend. What we teach in schools is very different than what was used to be taught. In the old days, we were teaching information. And I remember how many hours I spent learning by heart these chapters and this verse. With the changing world, information becomes obsolete before it gets to your desk. What is required is the knowledge of how to operate in a changing environment, in an environment in which the very information that you have becomes obsolete, and how do you adjust to yourself? And this is precisely the reason why the US economy has performed so well, yes, I say so well, especially relatively to other parts of the world. You know, we are covering here in Chicago, this is the heartland of America. And I happened to have been seated between two leaders of major corporations. And I asked, how is your business? They said, can't complain, actually, excellent. 2004 was a great year. Last night I had dinner at the conference board with Owens, the chairman of CEO of Caterpillar. How was last year? The best in our years. Yesterday I asked my own boss, Henk Greenberg of AIG, how was last year? The best of our history. And how was last quarter? The best in our history. And that's when you go step by step, one by one, you realize something is going on. But then you go home, you read the paper, and you say, do I read about the very same economy? Why is there this disparity between the numbers as they speak and the feelings that people have? I would submit to you that one of the reasons is, A, that we do not fully understand why we are doing so well, but we are. And second, that there are a lot of clouds there that we do not know how they will be cleared. I remember very well, immediately after September 11, a research group in New York has conducted a research. It was known at the time, this was before Iraq, it was known at the time that the US will do something as far as the Afghanistan is concerned. It was not clear what will happen, and it was not clear how will it resolve itself. And against this background, the questionnaire that was submitted to the typical household that was participating in the research had three questions. Question number one, assuming that the US is doing something in Afghanistan, and suppose that there is a success, whatever way it is defined, will you take your family on holiday next summer in the United States? And the answer was yes. Question number two, suppose that the US is conducting its operations in Afghanistan, and suppose that when next summer comes, it turns out to be non-success, failure. Would you then take your family on holiday in the United States next summer? And the answer was, well, in the United States next summer, of course, I'll go on holiday. Question number three, suppose that when next summer comes, you do not know if the operation was successful or not. Will you then take your family on holiday? And paradoxically, the answer was no. And when you think about it, it sounds like a paradox. If there is a victory, holiday. If there is a non-victory, holiday. And if you do not know if there is a victory or not, you stay home. And you say, isn't it a paradox? When you reflect on it, you see that it's really not a paradox. In psychology, there is a distinction that was imported actually from economics, from the writing of a very famous Chicago philosopher, economist, Frank Knight, who wrote in the 20s here at the University of Chicago. He drew the distinction between the concepts of risk and the concept of uncertainty. Risk is an environment in which we know to operate. We know that the outcomes may be this or that with a given probability. If we are statisticians, we also even know to characterize the distribution, what will be the tail, fat, narrow probabilities. Our life is operating under conditions of risk. We even know how to price it. Some of us know even how to insure against it. We make every moment and every morning a decision in this context, to take an umbrella, not to take an umbrella, based on the probabilities. But when the world is a world of uncertainty, where we do not know the rules of the game, where we are in a different universe, that's where you go to the bunker. That's where you say, I don't know, no holiday, no investment, I'm sitting on my hands until the clouds clear. This was the environment in early 2002 in this country, but the legacy of it is that we are not good in living and operating under conditions of uncertainty. We do not expect to know everything as we look ahead, but we need to know the rules of the game, we need to know the probabilities, and then we act accordingly. If you look at the last few years and you ask yourself, what kind of shocks our economy and the world had to go through? And I go to the late 90s with the Asian crisis in 97, with the Russian crisis in 98, with the LTCM long-term capital crisis in 98, with the collapse of the Nasdaq, with the collapse of the dot-com, with the collapse of the telecom, with the Enronitis, with the Argentina, with the corporate governance, with the SARS that affected China, with terrorism, with Iraq. So many shocks that each one of them in normal conditions would have meant a knockout. And yet, the slowdown of the US economy turned out to have been, I don't even call it a recession, turned out to have been shallow and mild, and last year, 2004, was the year, in terms of the numbers, in an extraordinary performance. Yes, the recovery has been what we call in economic jargon a jobless recovery. Namely, even though outputs, revenues expanded, jobs have not been created in a commensurate way. And the reason is the nothing short of spectacular improvements of productivity of the US productive processes and of the US industry. Namely, you need less workers, less input to produce the same output. Know-how, instantaneous spread of knowledge, you would have expected everyone to enjoy in the same way, provided you have flexibility. The US economy, being the most competitive, the most flexible economy, is capable of seizing opportunities when they are presented. And therefore, the composition of industry across activities, across locations, is much more malleable than in other places, the rigid places, call it Europe. You know, there was a prime minister in France many years ago. His name was Mendes France. And he wanted to convince his people to stop drinking alcohol. It's a true story. Maybe that's why it's funny. And in all the metro stations in Paris, there were signs. Drink milk, don't drink alcohol, it will kill you slowly. And somebody added a note underneath it saying, that's okay, we are not in a hurry. The fact is that when it comes to what we call in the jargon structural policies, those policies that remove distortions, that allow you to expand your operations, that create incentives, you must have the big leap. If you go slowly, you allow for all the lobbies in the world, the vested interest, to stop you from moving. And as a result, what we see in Europe today is a much more rigid continent than what needs to be the case. Well, I sound like optimistic, but I would hasten to say I'm optimistic but not sanguine. Why not sanguine? Because there are several important clouds in the US, and given the globalization of the world, The second part of the 90s was a decade in which very rapid expansion took place, but with it, a lot of imbalances got developed. In particular, savings in the United States fell and reached practically zero. And if we look today, or in the past few years, what happened to government savings, we should worry. There is a very large budget deficit, and all of you in the business sector know very well what happens if you spend more than what you earn, and it is true to the household, it is true to the firm, and it is true for the country. So if there is a very large budget deficit, it reflects itself in the fact that we are importing more than what we are exporting. We are borrowing from the rest of the world, and we call it a deficit in the current account of the balance of payments, and that's a big one. When Mexico had 5% of GDP current account deficit, all the bells rang and a crisis took place. Well, in the United States now the deficit exceeds that number. Of course, the United States, fortunately, is not vulnerable like Mexico was. It's a very large country, very large capital markets, but I would say there is no question that we cannot afford financing ourselves by foreign savings for too long. And why one should be worried in this case? The debt that the US issues in order to finance its excess spending is not sold all over the world in a random, atomistic way. In the past few years, a very large chunk of the new US treasuries that were issued were accumulated by very few buyers, primarily Asian central banks. Japan, China have accumulated, and it is something which, if I was a CFO of the US, I would be worried of depending on too few for so much. Now, of course, one can always ask the question, why do the Chinese and the Japanese central banks accumulate that? I said, that's a different conversation. But what we see today is with the large current account deficit, there is a pressure on the US dollar, and the US dollar has weakened with significant implications, and we can discuss it a bit later. But what I can say is that, like always in policies, you do not need to do today the complete package, but you need to have a clear trajectory that is credible, that the markets know that if you are doing it today, you will get somewhere in real time. Coming back to the risk and uncertainty, I will know to operate in a world in which the US continues to borrow, but there is a clear trajectory that tells me where I am. And that's why the decisions today in the US about what will happen to the budget and by implications what will happen to the current account of the balance of payments are so critically globally. If it's not done, then the US dollar depreciates, which means the competitive nature of our trading partners, call it Europe for that purpose, is deteriorating. What will be the implication of that? Well, we already know. There are more and more calls for protectionism. Because protect us from the foreign competition and protect us from this. And all of us who know that the better companies that succeeded are those that were integrated into the global environment should worry if indeed protectionism will take hold. Because protectionism is not just how to prevent foreign goods from coming to our shores. Protectionism is basically closing windows to many more exchanges, from knowledge through goods and services, and labor. So I would say, therefore, that if I had to put one important danger on the horizon, it is protectionism. And, you know, if there is one area that there is huge gap between the pure economic analysis and the less pure political debate, it is in this area. you have significant lobby for protectionism. The important point is that we need to understand what underlies the various disturbances. I'll give you an example. There was last week a meeting of the G8. The G8 were the 7 industrial countries plus China. They should have discussed the issues that tie them together. The US should have said what will happen to our budget. Europe should have said what happens to our rigidities. China should have said what happens to our exchange rate, etc., etc. Let me assure you this was not the topic. It was not the topic because it is not politically, it's not convenient to discuss these tough issues. So therefore one talks about the manifestation and about the dollar instead of the budget. Much more easier to speak about it. So that's the issue of the fundamentals. And the problem is that the model is not fully understood. I'll give you, since time is running, I'll give you another story about the model. I'm a great believer in fundamentals. There was this guy, he was an atheist, and he was driving around the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. I don't know how many of you tried to find a parking place in that loop. Well, he could not. He was desperate, and he raised his hands in despair and said, God, if you are there, I am an atheist, but if you find for me a parking place, I promise I will start going to church or synagogue, depending on who he was, or mosque, and I will do everything as my grandfather taught me to do. He didn't finish thinking about this brilliant idea, and suddenly a car pulled out and a beautiful parking place presented itself. He came in and said, God, no need, I found one. He did not understand the model, the link between his wish and the reality. If we speak about exchange rates, not linking it to the budget, not linking it to the rigidities, and not linking it to this type of things, we are bound not to recognize where the parking place came. And I think that's one of the important issues that both the professionals and the media should bring. Let me conclude these remarks, so to speak, of the CAF remarks, with 2 observations. The world is bound to have unexpected events. Some of some magnitudes, like the very presence that I have here tonight, some of more major implications, but there is no way that policymakers can or should avoid all crises. And it's a major policy issue. Should you over-regulate or should you under-regulate? Let me be very concrete. I remember when I was governor of the central bank, I called my bank supervisor and I asked him, tell me, what will be the success of your term? How will you define it? Because we wanted to have metrics. And he said, I, as a bank supervisor, will view my term as a success if under my watch, I will need to close no bank, and all banks will remain open. I thought that this guy will over-regulate. Let me continue the same line. Given that you cannot avoid all crises, what system is better? The one that your policies is successful in eliminating 3 out of the next 5 crises, or the one in which your policies succeed in eliminating 5 out of the next 3 crises? And that's not a play on words. It's the difference between regulation that stifles the economy, that overdoes it just because we want to be more sure about the outcome, that kills free enterprise, that removes incentives, that avoids and succeeds to eliminate car accidents by closing the roads and eliminate driving. I'd rather have a system in which you deal with the crisis of car accidents by widening the roads, by improving the roads, yes, by installing seat belts for the cases in which a crisis, an accident took place, so you want to minimize the damage thereof. So the real distinction is, and this is a major topic which I will not enter into, about the regulatory environment today. And I don't hint into any bias of my view about it, but there is a question. Should we avoid 3 out of the next 5 or 5 out of the next 3? And that's a major philosophical question with a profound policy implication. Final observation. I had a colleague at the University of Chicago. His name was, still is there, Bob Lucas. He's a Nobel Prize laureate at the university. I was flying at the time quite a bit, and he asked me, Jacob, how many times did you miss a flight? And I told him, I never missed a flight. And he said, then you must be wasting a lot of time in airports. Let me suggest that there is one important common theme to all my remarks. What's the definition of a success? Not to miss a flight? Not to close a bank? To avoid 5 out of 3? I think we need to reflect on this. But the world is different now than what it used to be. We have a new paradigm. I started by mentioning that the locomotives of the world are different. It's not anymore Germany, Japan. Japan has had a decade of a recession. It is now China, 9.5% growth. It is India, it is Asia, completely new paradigm. In 1995, there was a crisis in Mexico. The tequila crisis caused capital flight. Where did the money go? It went to Asia. In 1997, there was the Asian crisis. Where did the money go? To Mexico. And you ask, what's happening? And I remember at that time somebody said there are 2 types of investors, those with short memories and those with no memories. But upon reflection you realize that the Mexico from which the money escaped in 95 was not the Mexico into which the money returned in 97. The only common part was the name of the country and the geography. It was a country with different policies, and that's the good news. If you do the wrong policies, you are penalized, but if you are doing the right policies, you are rewarded. So the new paradigm is policies matter. Third observation in this regard. Argentina went into a deep crisis in 2001. In the old days, there was no chance for Latin America to recover if Argentina stayed behind. Argentina was the centerpiece. And what happened in reality? Latin America recovered, Argentina stayed behind, and then Argentina did whatever it did. It's now starting to pick up. But the reality is that the guilt by association, if you are part of a region, you are doomed if you are the neighbor of the wrong country, has also been departed. Investors are much more sophisticated in knowing to separate the right guys and the wrong guys in the economic sphere. Asia, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there would not have been a chance that Asia would recover as long as Japan stays behind. What happened thereafter? Asia moved on and told goodbye to Japan. and Japan will need to earn its way back to the growing place. In other words, the role of geography becomes less critical. It's not so important who your neighbor is, it's more important what you do. And likewise, the role of history becomes less critical. It's not so important what happened to you, Mexico, in 95. It matters what you do in 98 in order to explain. Much more dynamic world, much more sophisticated things. Which means that there is good news and bad news. Bad news is that if you plan to do the wrong things, don't expect somebody to bail you out. And don't expect in the US that growth in Europe or China will do the job for you. Unfortunately, the US is sufficiently flexible. The US actually is the best country in the world economically, no question about it. But by the same token, some of the other countries will need to wait until they do the right things in order to get out of the thing. Well, the chairman told me that my time is up. I appreciate very much, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Frankel. You've consented to ask a few questions, answer a few questions, and you've actually touched on a lot of these, but let me see if I can work them in here. You've already commented on the value of the U.S. dollar versus the yen and other currencies, but can you give us a couple of concrete steps that we could do to sort of bring the dollar value back up?
Well, that's the question that normally policymakers and even former policymakers are not very happy to deal with, the value of the currencies. But I think that in this particular case, one of the puzzles that the economic profession actually faces these days is how come the dollar has not declined even by more as compared with what we see today, especially in view of the fact that the current account deficit is so large and not shrinking dramatically. One of the reasons is that still the dollar represents the currency of the largest economic base in the world. And the demand for dollar globally is not just a function of what the deficit is, but it is, as asset holders decide where to invest, where would they go? If a Martian came down to Earth, not knowing much about where things are happening, and he has to decide where to put my wealth, what will he ask? He asks which economy is a true democracy, where property rights are defended, which economy is flexible, etc. He will also ask, of course, about the budget, but the reality is that in this comparison, the US will score pretty high, especially as he looks into Europe and he sees a rigid continent. As you can see, I don't hide my relative bearishness of what's going on there. And when I look at the policy debates there, you know, when Europe created the European Union and the International and the European Monetary Union, the main pillar was the so-called the Maastricht Treaty, under which the government signed to what is called the Stability and Growth Pact, namely, we will not have budget deficits in excess of 3%, so they said, etc., etc. And when the budget deficit exceeded 3%, if it was for a small country, it was reprimanded. If it is for large countries, like Germany, like France, then they change the pact. You can always hit the target if you move it around where you live. But an investor, our friend from the Mars, who decides where to invest, he would not like that environment as much as in the US. So one of the reasons why I also think it is so imperative for the US policymakers to project some concrete measures on the budget and the current account is precisely to continue to secure that kind of stable environment that will bring foreign investment. Let me just say what not. I was engaged when I was at the IMF in the so-called G7 policy coordination process, where much was discussed about intervention in the foreign exchange market. I think the lessons have been learned. Interventions in foreign exchange markets by central banks in order to manipulate the value of the currency that is not, in a way that is not consistent with the fundamentals is bound to fail. The ocean is just too big for a small bucket of water to change the level. Capital markets are so big, there is not enough reserves in any central bank basement to impact fundamentally. Once you agree that intervention is not the right solution, you are forced to go back to the fundamentals. So that's what I would do, go back to the fundamentals.
Thank you. Now that the Greenspan era is reaching an end, do you think we can declare victory over inflation? And if we have, what's the next tiger we have to fight?
The Greenspan era is a concept that can extend significantly beyond Greenspan's term in office. But yes, Greenspan's term in office is in its last round, and therefore one of the most important appointments that the president will need to appoint is the successor, not replacement, the successor for the chairman of the Fed. We have had a fantastic sequence of Volcker, Paul Volcker, and Alan Greenspan. And each one of them did exactly what the textbook would have expected to do from a courageous and a professional central banker. I know that as a former governor, the model of central bank activity in the US has served as a very role model. Remember, last night I had dinner with Paul Volcker, I think I mentioned it, and we spoke a little bit about the legacy. It was not tough. It was very tough and not easy to raise rates in the way that he did in the early 80s in order to break the back of the inflation. He really needed to break all the eggs to make this omelette. He needed to take the punch bowl away while the party was going. You know, this is the dictum that a former chairman of the Fed, William McKinsey Martin, has coined. What a central banker needs to do to take the punch bowl away while the party gets going. So central bankers, in my judgment, really should never declare a victory of inflation because that's what their job is, to secure price stability. And occasionally maintenance, while it is less glorifying than reducing inflation, but maintaining price stability is a hell of a job. So I think, yes, there is still a hell of a job. But yet, the question is, what's the next tiger? I come back to the budget. But I hasten to say, central banks cannot deal with the budget. This is really a political decision par excellence that needs to be taken out by the Treasury and by the administration. But there is no question in my mind that in order to maintain and successfully maintain price stability, you better make sure that the background music from the budget and elsewhere is consistent with it. So I go back to the budget. But the second point is securing stability of the economic system. The world, as I said, is full of shocks. And if we are flexible, we can absorb those shocks in a much better way than if we are not. And I don't know if we are going to have another question or not, so let me just say one more word. How many of you know Chinese? I met earlier a person from China. Yes, I'm not sure whether it is correct what I'm going to say, but I'm told that in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two characters. One character is symbolizing danger, and the other character symbolizes opportunity. Which means, yes, a crisis is danger, but it's only half of the job. It's not good enough to say, I'm in a crisis, danger, wolf. Do something about it, turn it into an opportunity, and suddenly a crisis becomes the mechanism for the next acceleration. And fortunately, you need to be flexible to deal with it, and unfortunately, we have enough crises and dangers to give us the opportunities to excel.
The last question, and something that's on everyone's mind here. There are some proposals floating around to introduce fundamental changes in the tax system, including the adoption of perhaps a flat tax or a value-added sales tax. Do you think that's a good idea?
If I was interviewed in private by Terry Savage, well, I'm sure she is the architect of that question, she would not have allowed me to get off the hook without a yes or no. Come on, stop being an economist on one hand, on the other hand. But I'm on the podium, so I have an advantage. Well, let me say that significant improvement in the tax policy and the tax structure of the US is an extremely important issue, and hopefully will be able to be introduced. I would classify it within the other issues which I emphasized, which are called structural measures. Those measures that remove distortions, those measures that are consistent with the incentives and the like. But I want to make 2 points on those specific proposals, and to keep it in mind. First, it will be said if, as we introduce improvements in the tax system, we will not be cognizant of the fact that we have a very critical budget deficit challenge. So let's try to make sure that such improvements in the tax system, and there are a lot of improvements to be there, are at least neutral as far as the budget deficit. I would not be comfortable if somebody told me, yes, at least we improved the tax structure, yes, at the cost of a larger budget deficit, so it's a toss-up, one better, one plus, one minus. No good. We cannot afford today a larger budget deficit. Second, the tax system is a very, very complex matter, which involves both incentives, and second, it involves mechanisms for redistributing income from groups of the population. Many systems of governments see great virtue in transferring income from higher earners to lower earners as a social policy. And that's their choice. It's a political decision. The economist comes in by saying, it's your choice how to allocate the income, but make sure you don't distort the incentive.